HIV Hour is the UK's only show for people living with HIV, sharing stories, news, and views on living positively with the virus.
Welcome to the HIV Hour, Nathaniel J Hall. I feel like you need no introduction, but I'm going to give it a stab anyway. So you are a freelance theatre maker, writer, performer, director, producer, and a HIV activist, and now a documentary filmmaker. How are you today?
I'm great, thank you. That's quite the list, isn't it? I always say master. What is it? Jack of all trades, master of none. Put my finger in any pie and see what sticks. That sounds rude, didn't it? I shouldn't have said that.
Exactly, but before I do want to find out why you got on board with this documentary, but we are talking specifically. It's a new documentary called Bug Chasers: The Men Who Want HIV. And this is part of Channel 4's documentary series on their YouTube channel. Now, first of all, I didn't even realize Channel 4 offered this on the YouTube channel. How did it come about and how did you get involved in it?
Yeah, well, I've known about bug chasing for a while. I mean, first off, we should say right at the start here, bug chasing, which is people who fetishize or fantasize about contracting HIV or passing it on to others, represents a tiny, tiny minority of people, like a minority within a minority within a minority. So it doesn't pose any significant risk to kind of public health, and it's not something that people should be generally worried about, but it's a phenomenon. I've lived with HIV for 20 years, and it's a phenomenon that I've known about for a long time. And I think most, particularly gay and bisexual men living with HIV, will probably be aware of it. They will have maybe been asked. I've been asked a number of times to gift my HIV to someone, which is a sort of slightly surreal and strange experience to be asked that. And I think there's always these myths abound, isn't there? Like about sort of these bug chasing parties or Russian roulette parties. You know, I know a friend of a friend who got HIV because they went to a Russian roulette party, which is, you know, where apparently one person is HIV positive, or whether these gifting parties where people are, you sort of like, it's celebrated as someone is given HIV. And I sort of was going, I wanted to know whether it was just urban myth, because there's plenty of urban myths out there, right? Or whether it was really happening. Um, and so I wanted to go out and kind of find out if it was happening, and if it was happening in real life and not just fantasy or urban myth, you know, who was doing it and why, and try and kind of dig under the skin of it. So that's really how it came about.
Right, so you approached Channel 4 with the idea.
Actually the stars aligned, and the production company that made it came to me and said they were looking to make something about HIV, and we started a conversation, and that's where it went from.
That's brilliant. And obviously, it is a remarkable documentary. Obviously, it is free to watch on YouTube, which is brilliant again. But you seem to visibly struggle while making it with the impact it had on you. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, it's definitely an immersive documentary in every sense of the word. And it's only a 20-minute short doc, so you don't really get to see the level of immersion that I had for about 3 or 4 weeks. I really threw myself into this world. And I set up profiles to try and meet people, to try and speak to people, to try and sort of get into the networks and groups where this sort of things were taking place, and find out more. You know, some of it's very open. You can quite easily find it on hookup apps like Grindr and other kind of dating apps. You can find it quite easily on Twitter, actually X, formerly known as Twitter. So it's the only thing we're allowed to dead name, is that I get away with it. We call it Twitter. But also on Telegram, which is a little bit like WhatsApp, but totally like unregulated. It's a bit like the dark web. So sort of anything goes on Telegram. And there are some groups on there that I managed to get invites into, which were quite dark, and there was quite a lot of extreme BDSM and sexual fetish taking place in those, and what also looked like self-harm, and a lot of drug taking as well. So there was sort of throwing myself into that world and seeing these images and seeing this kind of the way people were talking to one another, and was quite heavy. And you don't really see any of that in the documentary because there's no time to show it. But some of the stuff I saw, and it's not to say that this is directly connected to bug chasing, but there is overlap in these worlds, was quite upsetting. And there was, like I say, there was what felt like a lot of at times people stuck with drug addiction or struggling with drug addiction, with self-harm, harming each other, sort of collective self-harm, and sexual practices that felt, quite difficult to watch. And talking to some people, and again, not everyone, but talking to some people who very much recognized that they were in need of help. And yeah, so it was a challenging one to make, and also obviously given the subject matter, and the difficult line I walked, and it's the first documentary I've ever made, is that actually I didn't just turn up as a journalist. I turned up as a HIV activist, so I'm an educator in a sense, and I have a mission, which is to end new transmissions of HIV by 2030. That's my goal in the work that I do. But I'm also HIV positive, and I come with all that bias as well. And so I had to really, really work hard to try and be aware of my bias, not switch it off, but be aware of it and try and understand, because that's the whole point, right? And try and understand rather than immediately jump to conclusions or judge. So yeah, it was a tough whole few weeks filming it.
But I imagine with that came an understanding and an empathy and an insight. You could perhaps not necessarily agree with what you discovered, but you could certainly relate to an extent with some of it. That's how I felt. I have an experience with chemsex, so a lot of it I recognized. Let's delve into it. So there's the two groups, isn't there? Two fractions, the chasers and the gifters. So yeah, tell us a little bit more. Obviously, you can watch a documentary for full understanding, but essentially you have the chasers who are the ones seeking HIV.
Yeah.
And there's, as you said, there's various reasons why these people do this, whether it comes down to mental health or whether it's a fetish. Have you come away, having met some, have you got a deeper understanding, a more acceptance of it, or not acceptance? I don't know how you describe it.
Well, I think one of the things, I can't remember which sexologist said it, but quite a famous quote in the world of sexology is that if you can think it, someone's doing it. So the spectrum of human sexuality and sexual fetish is extremely broad, and obviously that then we know sweeps into territory that becomes grey, and then into territory which is unethical, where we go, absolutely, that is a red line, when we look at sexual practices that harm other people or harm people, or we look at paedophilia or something like that. But this is not in that bracket at all, because there's people who are doing this consensually, so there is a consensual act taking place between adults. But I guess what did I learn about it? Well, really, I think the more you talk to people involved in it, the more you realize that potentially there is actually, within the small minority of people who are engaged online, the actual number of people doing it in real life, it diminishes again. And there is a lot of people who are fantasizing. And actually, in the documentary, I speak to a researcher called Dr. Jamie Garcia Iglesias, who is actually, I think, has written one of the only papers from a European perspective on the phenomenon. And, he said very much from his research that the longer you talk to people, the more you go, this story doesn't quite add up in parts. And so you're not quite sure, and it destabilizes, and you go, maybe there is and his sort of conclusion is that actually online people are authoring together, creating a story and mass fantasy that is around this, and the thrill comes from the increased level of risk involved. So as you heighten that risk, you heighten sexual pleasure. So talking about this to other people online becomes sexually pleasurable. And he said his research he didn't find any evidence that people were engaged in real life. Now, my experience is different to that. I have met people both through the documentary and outside of the documentary. I have absolutely no doubt that what they're telling me is the truth. So I think it does happen in real life as well. But I think the reasons are so broad and varied from person to person. I didn't really find one concrete reason. And I found some people who I interviewed who actually didn't make the cut of the documentary. One person who had the fetish but didn't want it. So was sort of going, I don't want to enact this out in real life. I am taking PrEP. It's a fantasy and it's actually something that I dislike about myself. Whereas I met other people who are the total opposite, who are like, we see one in the documentary, he's out loud and proud and everyone knows about it and doesn't seem to have any on the surface residual shame or anything about that. Um, and everything in between. And people who say they want to get HIV because life with HIV is easier. There are people who say that they feel that they want to be connected to a community or a brotherhood or connected to their past, to the community's past. So there's a kind of becoming HIV positive is seen as is it seen as a gift? You become part of this community, and that's a difficult one because at first I go, that's very strange, but then I go, well, I've lived with HIV for 20 years and I found an amazing community
Yeah,
through that. So it's very hypocritical of me to sit around and go, well, you're not allowed to find the community that I found. So, but then on the flip side, I'm like, but I also don't want you to get an incurable illness because let's face facts, although it's treatable, it's for life and it's life-changing diagnosis as well. So yeah, it kind of throws up, the more you delve into it, it throws up more kind of moral and ethical dilemmas and more
exactly. And
questions.
kind of normalizes it to an extent. And you talked about earlier, like, yes, it is a very small community of people at the moment, but there is that concern that it is a snowball effect, and that if it continues to grow, even on a fantasy level, it will then eventually knock onto the more real life cases. So that is why it needs to, I agree with you, it needs to be kind of addressed or certainly looked at, and certainly where people need help, they get it. I think within that, with the things that I related to were my personal experience of contracting HIV. I knew about HIV. I was diagnosed 8 years ago while I was involved in chemsex, and I didn't use protection. I didn't take PrEP, even though by that point in the timeline it was available. I could have taken it. And I look back, and it is possibly one of my biggest regret that I didn't, but it was down to self-worth. I remember not feeling like I deserved to be here. So it's a shame when you look reflectively on things like that. And like I say, I took those risks because it was no longer a death sentence. I think if it were, I would have taken more care. I certainly would have had more respect for myself. But these are all things that you learn with time.
Yeah. Well, just go back to what you just said there about, self-worth and kind of understanding maybe the gravity of a diagnosis and stuff. This bug chasing is not a new phenomenon. And there's a film on YouTube from 2003, which is the year I was diagnosed. We're going to have very different landscape in HIV. It's about 6 or 7 years from effective medication, called The Gift. And it's a little bit sensationalist and it's very American in its construction and stuff, but that follows someone who essentially has fallen into this world and then become HIV positive and regrets it. But going back even further than that, there is documentation of a subculture, a community of people intentionally getting HIV. And I actually spoke in the documentary to the person in America who is sort of coined as the first person to speak publicly about it, sort of the original chaser, the original kind of bug chaser. And he didn't, again, it didn't make the cut. He used to be a porn star and a sort of a sex party host in America. And people talk about getting HIV on their own terms, and there's a very fatalist at that point, a very fatalist standpoint where people go, I know it's a death sentence, but I can't relax when I'm having sex. And again, I'm not a trained psychotherapist or psychologist, but you start to unpick and go, well, what is going on there for someone to go that my life is like that I would put my life on the line for this sexual pleasure in a sense. And he talks about very much knowing that when he contracted HIV that he was gonna die. He actually didn't, because effective medication came in a few years later. So in a sense, he was very lucky.
Yeah, I absolutely do remember there was an anxiety around catching HIV before I did, where I would go and get tested regularly, sexual health screenings, and you always worried that one day you were going to catch it. And there was bizarrely a sense of relief when I did catch it because it was then controllable. It meant that I was able to then take control of it and I wouldn't be able to pass it on because I would take medication and be undetectable. So there was a kind of relief that you're no longer kind of running from this virus, that you've actually kind of tackled it head on. But it is such a weird dynamic. But this is where I feel the protection needs to come in. And there's a level of responsibility and accountability for the gifters. Because although they feel that it is consensual, we can delve into that now. Because what were your take on the gifters when you met them? And did you agree to an extent with what they were doing, or did you still oppose it?
In terms of the gifters, where do I sit on that? I mean, the person I meet in the documentary, who describes himself as an ethical gift giver, so he very much, he says he very much speaks to people at length before, so they understand. He certainly wouldn't do this on a whim, and he, yeah, and he said to me that he had gifted successfully to a number of people. Again, is it fantasy? Like, was I part of his fantasy? Was it part of his fantasy coming on the documentary, to kind of have that status within this subculture, with us in the community? How much of what is being said is real and what is not is all up for grabs again. But, I guess if you take people at face value and what they're saying, then I guess I don't have any reason to doubt him, that he gave me in any way, shape, or form. So it's a tough one because we all have people live with HIV. We all have that person that gave it to us, whether we know who that person is or not. And I guess we probably all also, particularly people like myself who've lived with HIV for a long time, live for a long time with the fear of passing it on. Now we have U equals U from about, 2017, 2018. That science was not around before then. And so very much you're living with the fear of passing it on. And I also was diagnosed in the era before you were put onto medication straight away. So I had 5 years unmedicated. So even more so feeling like a ticking time bomb. I was talking about like when having sex, I felt like having a grenade in my hand. And so I know what I would feel like, how devastated I would be. And I think most people living with HIV would be so devastated if they passed it on to someone else. Because despite the fact that it is treatable and it's one tablet a day, and for the most part, we get on with our lives, I think people living with HIV, most of us have lived with the mental and psychological impact of that diagnosis, rightly or wrongly, around the HIV stigma, the shame, the linking to the ways that we contracted it. So I don't ever want anyone else to go through that, because of me. So it's very hard for me to meet someone who then just really doesn't have any of that framework or frame of reference around HIV, and very much for them, it's a positive thing. So it was real challenging to kind of try and put my experience to one side and try and understand from their experience. And if we try and strip away for a minute what we feel, the stigma, the shame that we might feel, and imagine a world where we go, this is just a virus, in the way that chlamydia is just a bacteria. And we take HIV off its pedestal as this life-changing thing. You can sort of go, okay, yeah, maybe it isn't that big a deal. But also in the same kind of thought, these people do this because it gives them sexual thrill, right? So if the reason it's given them sexual thrill is because it is seen as subversive, because it goes, things that we often get sexual thrill from are things that are taboo, yeah, so And so this is seen as a subversive act. This is seen as a dangerous act, a risky act, and it's the risk that heightens sexual pleasure. So these people, on some level, understand the same things that we understand. But I guess as I try and conclude in the documentary, we've lived with 40 years of HIV, gay bisexual men, men who have sex with men, born in the late 70s into the 80s, like me, in the 90s. We've lived with it. Like, it is part of our world. We have no other frame of reference, and it has impacted us in many, many different ways. And I think some people, like I say at the end of the documentary, some people go to therapy, some people get into kinky shit, some people do both. So
Do you think there should be and is an accountability with someone? Although you say there are people who consensually ask for it and that any load taken is consent, but are they in the right frame of mind? Do they have the full understanding? And despite a gifter who might explain as well as they can, that person clearly is still impressionable and still hasn't really grasped the full gravity as you and I living with HIV can understand. Do you think the accountability should be on the gifter to know to just protect that person regardless of what they're asking for?
yeah, I think consent is a hot topic, isn't it? And rightly so. And I think sometimes in our community, if there is such a thing, there are areas and spaces that where the boundaries of consent are blurred. We know that takes place in spaces, chemsex spaces, for example, sometimes in other sex spaces, sex clubs, dark rooms, etc. And sometimes there is a sense that by entering this space, consent is assumed, etc., etc. And it's a really tricky thing because policing consent in those spaces, is just fraught with difficulty. And I never want to come in and be like, the morality police here, because I've done things in my life, we've taken sexual risks, and that's sometimes part of being human and part of fantasy and part of our sexuality. Um, so it would be, again, hypocritical of me to sort of come in and go, this is how it should be done. And there is no hard and fast rule, I think. I think when it comes to this issue, partly because of the HIV epidemic and the response to it, which actually in the UK is very different to America. America went all the charities and health authorities, it was condom use only. It was condom, 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 condom. No other message. Whereas here in the UK, we took a slightly different approach, which was condoms, absolutely. But if you're choosing not to use condoms, here's other ways in which you can practice safer sex or less risky sex. So here are sexual practices you can do that reduce the risk, for example. And I think that's why, we've seen a huge drive towards PrEP as well, which is like, let's get another thing in our toolkit that can help people protect themselves. And so there's less of that kind of finger wagging of going, do it this way, or you're going to get, or you're going to die sort of thing. I think that's a good approach. But it does rely on like a lot of education. And I think, we sometimes look at people taking risk and we roll our eyes or tut, but I actually think most people in this country, despite poor sex education, but in our community, are actually quite sexually savvy. And most people do know how to get tested, where to get tested, and they know the risks and they make decisions based on that themselves. Within that, I do think we've taken quite an individualist approach to sexual health, which is I'll look after my sexual health and you look after yours. So it's like, get on PrEP so you're safe, or use a condom to protect you, or tell your partner to use a condom so you don't, to protect you. And I think what we've missed in this mix in our education is going, how do we care for one another? How do we create a community that cares? And the thing that really highlighted this to me was when I went into my most recent relationship. So I'd lived with HIV from the age of 16, first sexual experience. So from that moment on, I lived with having to disclose to partners, tell partners, decide when I was going to do that, worrying about unintentional transmission, worrying, going to the clinic, them constantly telling you about the law every single time you go, which is their duty. I know, but it's heavy stuff. And so feeling like it was always my responsibility. And then in that relation, that I went into the relationship I'm in now, and he knew I was HIV positive. He'd come to see my show first time. He'd see my interviews on telly, and before we as we knew it was going to go somewhere, he came to me and he said, "I'm taking PrEP. How do you want to manage this?" He was the first person in, at that point, what, 17, 18, 17 years, that had held the conversation for me. And I
Wow.
realized how much I'd carried. And so it reminded me that actually we should be encouraging one another to hold that conversation. How do you want to go about this? This is how I'm protecting myself. What are you comfortable with? Um, and I know that doesn't necessarily sound the sexiest thing, but I think it's something that we could aspire to. I care for you and you care for me. And then within that, once we know what the lay of the land is, let yourself go, do what you like and enjoy it, because sex is great.
Yeah, because you mentioned this in the documentary, your concerns about making the documentary, that you were worried that you might be demonizing the community by making it. But you seem to kind of come around, and as you've just spoken, you do recognize the impact and the need for these conversations. And I think you summed it up beautifully at the end, where you said we are all just seeking connection in a community and a world that doesn't always make us feel welcome. Is that the take that you got when you look back reflectively on all the experience you got from making this?
Yeah, and I think a lot of the people I spoke to, I'm very lucky and blessed. I grew up in Stockport, South Manchester, so close to Manchester's gay village. I grew up with an imperfect but thriving queer community. There's an actual sense of a community and place where we gather together. Manchester Pride, one of the best prides in the country. What an absolute privilege to have that on my doorstep and feel part of a community. But lots of people I met don't have that. They grow up in small towns, rural areas, and their connection and community is online, and it's not always found um, in the most healthiest and supportive environments. And so I understand why people who potentially might be lonely or might feel disconnected from what I feel as I have as a community, and find that in other spaces and places. And again, it's hypocritical of me to say to people that they can't have that and that sense of community. I guess making the documentary, speaking to the wonderful Dr. Cheddar Gorgeous, Michael Atkins, said, talking about something or trying to understand something doesn't mean you can condemn or condone it. You're just trying to understand, and that's really what where I land in the documentary of going, I think it's the right thing to do, because looking away when potentially harm is taking place, it makes me feel more uncomfortable than kind of looking at it.
Exactly. And just touching on the criminality of this, is it illegal to knowingly give someone HIV? And could these people, these gifters, be prosecuted? Did you look into that?
Where the law stands on transmission of HIV, there is a specific law on reckless transmission of HIV, intentional reckless transmission in the UK. It's a law that's outdated, and I've actually put my name to a number of campaigns to get rid of. I think it came in the late 80s, early 90s, and it essentially puts all of us living with HIV at risk, and is unnecessary because it's also very hard in a court of law, to prove when transmission took place, when that actual virus went from one person to another, and also it's very hard um, to prove that it was intentional. It's just fraught with difficulty, and it then potentially puts all of us at risk of someone accusing us of that and having to be dragged through that awful experience. There is more legislation that's come in since then. So the 2003 Sexual Offences Act is a much broader and deeper look at a range of sexual offences around consent, and that has also had improvements added to it and amendments added to it over the years into things like upskirting and kind of revenge porn online and all that sort of stuff. So there's a whole new framework that could be used in a case where somebody, for example, has been, has been sexually assaulted, and as a result has become HIV positive. There's a whole framework of other legislation that could be used to prosecute in that circumstance that doesn't single out people with HIV or demonize people with HIV as an issue, as a problem. Because obviously you'll know yourself, in our activism, we're always trying to go like, we're not the enemy here. We're not, people with HIV are not, going around evilly spreading it around. Most people are trying desperately not to. And so in my own activism, I've sort of been quite vocal about that. But in terms of this scenario, I guess if you are gifting, you are opening yourself up to, I guess, more chance that somebody might turn around and go, you gave me that and I didn't want it, and it was intentional transmission, reckless transmission, and being dragged through the courts for that. So you're opening yourself up to that risk. It's an area that is fraught with so many more questions the more you delve into it. But if it is deemed a consensual act, then there is no crime, and that of course is correct, because I contracted HIV through a consensual sexual act, although on reflection potentially I was groomed, but also most people are contracted through a consensual act, and to criminalize that means that almost all of us with HIV would end up being criminalized, which is just absolutely not the right way to go.
And you did mention at the beginning of this conversation about the ways that people access these types of groups and forums through social media and through apps like Grindr and WhatsApp and Telegram. In a world of social media and accountability and free speech, do these apps and these companies have a responsibility, though, to kind of infiltrate and clap down, or should it be up to the free man to access what he wants?
I think we often go on the internet and we think we can access what we want, but actually the internet is more policed than we actually realize. When you go onto the dark web, if you've ever been on the dark web, or you use Telegram, which essentially is like a messaging service on the dark web, you soon realize quite how controlled the internet space is. It still feels like the Wild West sometimes. And I guess we're probably, as a society, I'm the first generation to go from analog to digital. The digital world didn't exist when I was born in the way that it exists now, and the internet world didn't exist in the way that it does now. And so we're still just grappling with it and trying to understand, I think, aren't we, how it's impacting us, how it's changing our society for the better, and potentially what issues. And I guess the internet probably only amplifies what's already there, and just probably speeds up the way in which we can connect, and these phenomena kind of spring up. But it doesn't mean to say that there wasn't problematic human behavior before the internet. So the thing with Telegram, which is not an app that I've used until I was doing the research for the documentary, that is completely unregulated, and some of the things that I saw in there were extremely disturbing, extremely shocking. I saw images of people tied up, being injected with drugs, videos of people being, trigger warning here, but people being raped, or the fantasy of that, other extreme sexual practices. I even saw human sacrifice on there in some of the groups that I was in. It was very extreme content, and I must stress that whilst there is overlap with bug chasing, not everyone who's into bug chasing is into this stuff. Very much, this is a sort of slightly separate thing, but the stuff that I saw in there was extremely graphic, and we know that, for example, that's also where images of war are shared, and a lot of propaganda is shared, and in a unregulated, unfact checked environment. So I think that's often probably a space where a lot of radicalization can take place as well. Um, it's also a place where you can access drugs very easily. And yeah, so it was quite shocking for me to be in that space and and literally have access to it on my phone. Like not hard, not like having to crack codes or do any computer hacking, just download an app and do it. So that was quite shocking. But I think, and it's a slippery slope when you then start to go, how do we police the information that people have access to? There's an argument when it's around getting information. It's really important to make sure you're getting your information from a reliable source, and from a number of sources as well. But this is not people finding information. This is people exploring their sexuality, and finding community. So I guess in terms of where I think we could improve, I think we definitely need more understanding of how to limit access for younger people, for children. I know kids have more more tech savvy than we are. And I think it's really super. I'm so glad I don't have children. I just think it's super important that adults, before they have children, know how they're going to manage that transition into the digital space and how their children are going to have access to that and what limits they have on that. Um, because some of this stuff I witnessed and I experienced. So most people will look at it, go, do you know what? Not for me, move away. But for some people, it may spark something, and particularly around things like falling into drug addiction, seeing images that are glamorizing drug use, um, sort of glamorizing chemsex, which again, in of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. Some people can manage, taking drugs and having sex. Lots of people can't, lots of people fall into addiction. If I'd seen some of this stuff when I was younger, I'm not sure how I would have responded to now as a 37-year-old man with a lot of life behind me and a lot of life experience to understand and process that stuff. So I think, as well as kind of limiting access for children particularly, I think it's also about how do we create spaces for people to talk about these worlds and these spaces and places that exist. Because if you're lonely and disconnected, and your smartphone is your connection to other people, and that can be a great thing. I know people who are gamers and have friends all over the world through that. But if you're falling into a network of people who are, in for example, one of these Telegram groups, which is a sort of people who were addicted to crystal meth, and playing out all sorts of fantasies and actually filming themselves, injecting drugs. And if that's where you find your community connection at a young impressionable age, it could end up in quite a bad place for you. So yeah, tricky one.
And obviously, you mentioned how the documentary has led you to try and help change legislation. What do you hope that anybody watching this documentary might take from this documentary, or possibly actively do themselves?
I think if you one of the things I didn't really get to say in the documentary is that if you're engaged in sexual practice that you're struggling with, whenever that is, or that you're feeling shame about, or or you don't quite understand, or you're not in control of, there are people out there that can help. And there are people out there that understand, and you're not alone in that. You mentioned chemsex yourself there, and I've briefly skirted that world, um, and uh, and felt very isolated when I felt like I'd was the only person that couldn't maybe control impulses. And then all of a sudden, you speak to people and you realize quite how many other people have had that experience. So I think if you're feeling that way, your psychosexual sense of self and well-being is very powerful, and it can drag you into dark places, but also it can help you into other places. And I think being open and talking to people is really important. So, you know, if you're struggling with anything with your sexuality, and I don't just mean as in I think I might be gay, within like sexual practice, you know, speak to someone. And also there are plenty of organizations out there that can help you navigate what you do find sexually pleasurable more safely. So much of queer sex is done in dark places. It's underground. You know, our first sexual experience as queer people often is in secret. Often we don't tell anyone it's happening. Sometimes it's slightly risky. You know, we're kind of sneaking out of our parents' house, or, you know, or doing, you know, having sex out, you know, not in a safe environment. It might be outside, it might be, you know, and that's not uncommon particularly for our generation. And so when you first have sex, you fuse a bond between risk and sexual pleasure. That's very powerful, and it's a very powerful drug, that, because every time you have sex you might want risk, but also secrecy becomes part of the act. And I know this from my own experience, and that can take you, it's not always the case, but it can take you down some dark paths. So I think the idea about sex positivity is a really interesting sort of antidote to that. Like, to go, this is the sex that I enjoy, and this is how, you know, and here's the way in which I mitigate risk. Every time I see or hear someone who's taking PrEP, I'm like, sing it from the rooftop, baby. Like, be proud that you are doing that. Yeah, I think the more we try and unpick the reasons why we're having sex individually for ourselves, and feel empowered, the better.
That's amazing. Honestly, it's been incredible to talk to you about such, as I say, quite an interesting, intriguing topic that does need to be talked about. Coming back to you now, so what work have you got coming up, and will you be making any more documentaries after this?
Wow. So in terms of work coming up, my show Toxic is touring the UK very soon. And that is a show that explores the impact of HIV stigma, racism, homophobia, toxic gender norms on a queer couple, 30-something couple who meet, fall in love, and mess it up, in their own words, quite spectacularly. It's semi-autobiographical. And then I'm currently just about to delve into writing my third show, which is a 3 in the trilogy. First time, Toxic, and the third is called A Hole, which is going to be a stand-up show, which is terrifying because I know I'm a funny guy, but the minute you go it's stand-up, I'm like, oh, okay, got to make people laugh. And so that's the next one. And that's a show about me. I fell out of love with my a-hole for a while, because it's been the site of some traumatic incidents, let's put it that way. But I've processed those. I've put all that on stage. I've performed it to thousands of people, and now I'm trying to fall back in love. So it's the journey of trying to find true pride, I guess, in myself and in what it means to be, you know, a gay man in the 21st century. So that's a-hole. And in terms of documentary, yeah, there's a few ideas in the pipeline. A couple more immersive things. Put myself into some risky situations for viewing pleasure. We'll see. But yeah, just waiting to get the green light from the powers that be to maybe kickstart and make those. So yeah, watch this space.
Brilliant. And for those who aren't already following you, where can they find you and keep up to date with everything you've got going on?
Well, you can find me on X. I'll call it its proper name. Worst rebrand in history, at Nathaniel J Hall, or the same on Instagram at Nathaniel J Hall, or my website, nathanielJhall.co.uk. And you can subscribe to my newsletter, but I'm going to be honest, I don't really send that many out, so probably I wouldn't bother.
Amazing.